Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Caffeine and Philosophy, the podcast. I'm Chris Robertson, aka CB Robertson, and we're going to kick this off with a particularly morbid subject, because why not? It's been in the news recently with two in the last 2 weeks now. The Buffalo shooting and the Uvalde shooting are the most recent one, and I'm sure some people listening to this will have been delighted with some even more recent shooting, because these things have become a regular part of American culture. And here we're going to try to talk maybe a little bit about why that might be. This is a subject that's been talked about at great lengths, and there's a few subjects that are relevant and important for people to understand, but not the things I want to dwell on extensively, but are worth going into at least a little bit here. So, off the bat, there is the phenomenon of SSRIs and other psychotropic drugs that almost every single one of these shooters was on. The SSRIs, for those of you who don't know, are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They're if I remember correctly, an antidepressant, anti-anxiety, massively overprescribed type of medication that's given out to all kinds of young men. And, some people in the online space in particular will say these cause the mass shootings. I'm not sure that's true, but I'm also not sure that the fact checkers who try to say, "Oh, that's not true, there's no evidence of that," are any more correct. Having no evidence one way or the other simply means we don't know. They very well could play a causal role. My own guess, and this is something I'm not particularly well educated on, so take this with a grain of salt, but my guess is that this might be a C causes A and B type of situation where, a deeper underlying problem causes a man to be put on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and at the same time causes him to be homicidally antisocial. They can be correlated without being causal. That would be my guess. So, but it's something that people should do more research on. It's a tragedy that we've been, sitting on Columbine for, 2 decades now, more, something like that. And we still there still isn't a lot of research looking into the relationship between those things. But anyways, that's maybe for someone else more knowledgeable to talk about. Another really important thing is the Incel Phenomena. It's not all mass shootings fall into this category, so Las Vegas obviously would not. But maybe 60 to 70% of the mass shootings we've seen fall into this incel description, involuntarily celibate. And this is Sung Hui Cho, this is James Holmes, this is Elliot Rodger, this is Adam Lanza, and of course, not to mention Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. Elliot Rodger is probably the most prolific of these examples because he was most explicit in his reasoning for it. But I think it might describe some of our more recent ones as well, like Jose Ramos and the Buffalo shooter, whose name I don't recall at the moment. Almost all of these shooters are young male virgins. And I'm reminded of some of the late Christopher Hitchens in his highly critical descriptions of the Islamic death cult, describing these people as repressed virgins. And they're very often also, young men driven to violence in pursuit of sex. Obviously, the shooters we're talking about here are not Islamic, maybe Pulse nightclub notwithstanding, but there's a similar drive at work there, and it is worth thinking about. I think we've been seeing a decline in monogamy culture in the United States and around the world due to feminism in part, but perhaps even more so due to urbanization and to the internet. You have this explosion in perceived options, and feminism certainly added to this, but just the economy of relationships is such that whenever you see I know it's considered crass to put these things in economic terms, but what are you going to do? It's sort of a reality that we have to deal with. Whenever you see an increase in supply, the perceived value of that thing goes down. And so people are much less willing to commit, much less willing to just settle down. They want to see where their options are. And in that kind of environment, you end up with maybe 20% of the high-value men getting something like 80% of the women, because women are a little bit more selective. So those men, those high-tier, high-power men, or highly attractive men anyways, get a lot more women, and it creates a loser class. The decline in monogamy culture creates a loser class at the bottom that is exceedingly resentful, not just of the women, vis-a-vis Elliot Rodger, but of society as a whole that permits this sort of thing to happen. Now, modern shooters are a, modern phenomena, but men going to war to acquire women is not. I mean, if you look at the history of the founding of Rome, the rape of the Sabine women was essentially an incel violent attack circa, 4th or 5th century BC, or whenever that was. So, men have always been willing to go to war, not just to protect women, but to acquire women. An excellent YouTube lecturer, Dr. Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, a behavioral biologist, talks about how the neural circuitry for violence has some crossover, has some shared pathways with the neural circuitry for sex. And in what I thought was a remarkably stupid take for such a brilliant man, he said maybe this is why some men confuse violence with sex, an allusion to sexual violence and rape and that sort of thing. I think the much, much, much more intuitive and obvious implication of that apparent neurological truth would be that, sex motivates men to violence, whether that's to protect women they love or to acquire women they love. And I think we might be seeing some of that in these incel turned mass shooters as well. Now, thankfully, mass shooting is fairly rare as far as an expression of this sentiment. More often, men just go to video games or go to porn until they can't get it up anymore, or any other kind of escapism from the reality that denies them these things. But it's an important aspect of it. But again, it's not the central thing to focus on. It's more of a prelude to what I think I can bring to this. And a final prelude point is this whole issue of guns. This is always the big political subject, naturally. And if we look at it through the same lens that we look at the SSRIs, we can see gun violence as a symptom rather than a cause. We lose, I'm just spitballing here, but the feeling I get is that we lose between 100 and 200 people a year to mass shooting since Columbine. A lot less before that, specifically to mass shootings. And here you have to be very careful because everyone likes to equivocate, all gun injuries with gun violence, with homicides, and they'll group in like NDs and suicides in with mass shooting, and they'll switch definitions around with what qualifies as a mass shooting, as they did in Australia, in order to make their numbers look pretty, and so forth. But mass shooters don't actually kill that many people per year compared to, say, car accidents or drug overdoses or things like that, or certain medical impositions. But they're very sensational, and so they attract a lot of attention. And I think what we're seeing here is that shootings are just the visible tip of a nihilistic despair iceberg that many of these young men are experiencing. Many young men across the nation, across the world. And mass shootings are not the primary or even really a significant expression of that. And if you wanted the most common violent expression of that, what you see is, or not violent, lethal expression of that, you would look at overdoses and suicides, which would far outweigh, mass shooting casualties. This kills, tens of thousands of men, if not more, hundreds of thousands of men annually, young men in this age range too. So it sort of begs the question, what are guns in this view? What do guns represent to people who are, feeling this kind of despair? And it's not just a sex thing, although that's a big part of it. And I want to spend most of the podcast here developing this idea here. Guns represent power in a powerless world. They're an expression of significance. And men seek dependence. Men want people to want them. And if they can't get positive dependence, then they'll settle for negative dependence. Okay, well, if you don't need me to help you, then I'll make sure you need to fear me. You'll depend on me sparing you, which is a horrible thing, but again, it's sort of a reality. And this, I think, is the dovetail into the religious dimension of this, which I think is worth talking about at length. I'm borrowing in that last idea from Doug Wilson, who in a podcast with a really good acquaintance, a friend, I think I can say, the Renaissance of Men, Pastor Doug Wilson said that society will always be dominated by men, if not positively, if not by their creative action, then negatively, by either their withdrawal or their active destruction of that society, if it leaves no place. And I think we're seeing that. And I think an important segue for everyone who wants statistics and wants to think about this quantitatively in terms of numbers, it's worth asking, why does this problem happen so much in America than in other countries? Even where, cultural problems are similar, there's this similar decline in monogamy, separation from older culture, and these other countries might not have access to guns in the same way. Many do, first of all, but even the ones who don't, they still have access to 3D printers. They still have access to bomb-making materials. They still have access to trucks or knives, or if you're in Sweden or Norway, bows and arrows. There have been a few stories. I think one of them was fake, but there are all kinds of ways to, impose yourself with violence and resentment on your society. Guns happen to be the American way, and it's sort of an interesting question on its own. But, nothing is stopping people in other countries from doing the same thing. I think what we see is the easier option is just to withdraw deeper into digital escapism. And I think that's the trend. It's certainly the trend in Japan, where the NEET population, not in education, employment, or training, young men who are living with their parents into their 30s, has become something of a national talking point, and in many ways even predated the American problem. But again, cultural differences took that in a broadly different direction. In America, we have the precedent of Columbine, and I think to really flesh that out, I want to talk about the nature of hero cults and how they've been cut down and how we're seeing them reemerge in a bloody fashion. And I'm not sure what we can do about it, if anything, but just as an explanation of this concept. So Alan Moore, the author of V for Vendetta and all sorts of other great works, famously said that he believed that all culture is built on cult. And I think that's true, not just etymologically, but historically and anthropologically and just factually. Hero cults and the stories of heroes and our participatory reenactment of the actions and stories of heroes are what give color and substance and connective tissue to our society. It's what unites us together. Now, how are hero cults established? Well, historically, a hero is someone who's pursuing immortality through the word. I mean, in their conscious intent. Through their subconscious intent. This may or may not be conscious. It was conscious in the ancient Greek world, at least in a few cases. But sometimes people achieve that status just trying to do their duty, and then they're, posthumously immortalized in this way. This is sort of how medals of honor work. But hero cults are established by the tragic death of a hero, usually in violence, and that death becomes memorialized in some way, usually in some seasonal fashion. You might have a certain holiday or a certain festival established in their honor. And the cult is maintained so it's established in violence, but it is maintained by non-violent participatory reenactment of the trials of the hero. So the Olympic Games are an interesting example. I don't remember the precise hero. Was it Pelops? I think it was Pelops. I don't know how to pronounce that. The Olympic Games are a seasonal homage. It was compensation for the death of the hero, Pelops. And they were in turn modeled on the Panathenaic Games, which were compensation for the death of Achilles. They were an expression of the Achilles hero cult, one that we still participate in to this very day, albeit for Pelops and not Achilles. But it's the same principle. And back in the day, some of these participatory reenactments actually were violent. So I'm maybe being a little general there. The early hero cults of the dead, of the ancestors, were sometimes performed by adolescent raiding parties who would paint their faces, for example, in order to take on the identity of the dead, and then they'd go off and do some ceremonial violence, i.e., cheeky vandalism, stealing cattle, whatever, these were the Kourios raiding parties of the steppe, and we see some evidence of that. Tacitus writes about the Hari warriors in Germany doing things like this. But that's, of course, not the only or even the main way that people would participate in these hero cults. The Greeks give us an example of, this will sound like a very esoteric digression, but I promise it's related, of chorus in tragic drama. So the chorus, when we think of a song in like contemporary music, it's the part that everyone can kind of sing along with. And that's by design. That was the intent, and there was actually a choral role in ancient Greek tragedy, that the audience, the adolescent youthful participants, would say these lines along as if they were participants, I should say, in the drama playing out on the stage. And this was in a sense initiation into the hero cult being dramatically played out. So they're participating their way into the society. And the value of these kinds of hero cults is that they provide these young men who are looking for something to do with this energy, this violent energy they have. It provides them orientation. It provides them value. It provides hierarchy and a means of ascending that hierarchy. And it provides concepts of meaning, not just in the language and in what these words that are deeply attached to these cult rituals. In fact, if Roy Rappaport is right, that ritual actually gives stable meaning to words in the first place. But also the more philosophical sense of meaning. And it gives a sense of belonging and, perhaps most importantly in today's age, agency. It gives all of this to young men who are looking for these things. And I mean, you can see an example of this in perhaps it's almost not a hero cult, but at the same time, it's arguably just the single most successful hero cult in all of history, and that's Christianity. Christianity is a hero cult of Jesus, and it does all of these things. It provides a non-violent participatory initiation into the hero cult, which commemorates the violent death of the hero and promises immortality through the word, demonstrates immortality through the word of the hero, who was perhaps pursuing that, perhaps not. But in any case, that was the effect. An example, and we could say, in a much more sort of lighthearted fashion, that my wife is very fond of saying that Christmas is a Santa cult in a very positive way. It's it's a seasonal thing. We have a hero. We don't know anything about his death, obviously, but we keep him alive through our participatory reenactment of his arete, his moment of glory, which is descending down a chimney to generously bring gifts to children in a dark and bleak part of the year. But when our ties to the hero cults that maintain our culture are severed, and young men are left disoriented and sort of treading water in a vast ocean of meaninglessness, the young men who would ordinarily become new initiates to the hero cults of their society either seek out new hero cults or try to establish their own. And I suppose it's worth mentioning another example of one of the darker aspects of this outside of America. We're here in America, we're very focused on mass shootings and as the darkest of expressions of this. But a little bit further south, there's another version of this that's not mass shooters per se, but has this dimension to it, and is much more explicitly religious, and that is the cult of the dead, the Santa Muerte cult. I'm not an expert on this. I would recommend someone like Ed Calderon if you were interested in learning more about that. But we see that the potential for growth of new cults like that elsewhere as well. And that brings us to Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, the two Columbine shooters, arguably the first major school shooters, and sort of the archetypes and the standard against which all future school shooters judge themselves and attempt to compete and outdo. I think Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris are best understood as candidates for a new hero cult, a nihilistic, violent hero. Well, violent hero cult might be a sort of superfluous phrasing. Almost all cults begin in violence, but in their candidacy for a new hero cult and their relative success, they seem to have a fair number of copycats who are imitating them implicitly or explicitly. It seems to be catching on and expressing something that many young men are feeling. They represent a backlash against the culture that makes young men feel superfluous and unnecessary, indeed a kind of burden and nuisance. So, we could hypothetically imagine a gun ban that would stop all of these. And in fact, perhaps there would be some reason to think it would, because if a severe enough gun ban blocked access to firearms, how could you reenact the violence done with guns that Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris set the precedent for? But it wouldn't stop it would only be treating the symptoms. It wouldn't be treating the cause, the religious cause of this feeling that's motivating the desire to participate in this very bleak and bloody new hero cult in the first place. And in fact, it might make it worse. If we see the phenomenon of young, bitter men shooting up schools and other public places, Aurora wasn't a school, as a symptom of a systematizing culture that treats people as idiots to idiot-proof things against, and as young men as a nuisance to push through these schools and get behind a desk and to otherwise just control and contain and keep happy, and gives them no sense of significance or being needed. Which measures like further gun control exacerbate. I think that would make the sentiment worse, not better. I think that would make people more upset. And you might replace something like a gun culture, which at least you can shoot back against, perhaps one day with something closer to a bomb culture, and not just like the Taliban with, fairly illiterate young men running around in pajamas trying to make bombs out of secondhand Soviet munitions, but something a little more intelligent and directed, something like Ted Kaczynski, or the IRA. It's not out of the realm of possibility. I don't think that that more low-resolution, systems-based solutions to a cultural upwelling against the void of modernism and liberal systems policy-based management is going to stop school shootings in the long run. I think it will make it worse. I don't really have and sort of in that vein, I don't know if there is a systems-based answer to it, but maybe a beginning place to start, at least, would be to reconnect with the hero cults of the past, if they are inevitable, which I think they are, and to reconnect with our religion and our community, and to facilitate a kind of interdependence at that local level rather than a pursuing this utopia of no one being dependent on anybody, which is, of course, whenever you dig into the details, a euphemism for everybody being dependent and feeling dependent upon the government, which seems to make people vindictive and angry and resentful and violent. Just some food for thought, and I'm sure we will talk more about this in the future, but that's all on this morbid subject for now. Talk to you guys later.